Hi there, my name's Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel BandysBooks, and today we are here to do an end of the month wrap up for April. What a month April was. Let me just tell you, it went so differently than I planned. I ended up getting really sick for like a whole week in April and not recording any videos, which was a bummer, but it did have one benefit, and that was that I was participating in a couple of readathons. So I was reading for Trans Girl April, and I was also hosting a team for the Nevermore-athon. This was my first time hosting a team on a readathon, and I am a hyper competitive type of person. Oh, thank you for the kissies. So if I'm dragging my feet on doing something and you want me to speed it up, the easiest way to do that is convince me it's a competition, because then I go into ultra competitive mode and go way above and beyond what I needed to do. So my statistics for this month are insane. I don't even know where to start, honestly. I'm gonna have to go through this really fast because there are so many books to cover. Let's go into statistics, and I'm gonna tell you how many books I read, and then I'm gonna explain why I read that many books and how I read that many books, because even to me, it seems like an impossible number. For the month of April, I ended up reading 52 books. Now, I can hear you frantically typing in the comments already, that's not possible, you're faking it, you're lying, whatever. First, let me explain that 15 of those books were novellas, so under 200 pages, which makes them the type of book that I can read in a couple hours. And then the vast majority of my books were between 200 to 300 pages. I only had one book that was above 500 pages. And I didn't initially intend for that to go that way. I picked out like 15 books for Trans Girl April, and I didn't like sit there and intentionally pick short books. Those were just the books that I came across. And then I had a handful of books that I picked out for prompts for Nevermore-athon, and I didn't necessarily pick really short books there. But realizing that my team was the smallest team in Nevermore-athon and that there were a couple teams that were reading on like insane levels just caused me to click into overdrive. I started looking at all of these novellas that I wanted to read because I was looking for things that I could get through pretty quickly. And I remembered that the Wayward children's series is a series of novellas. I had read the first book and I'd been wanting to go back and read the rest of them, so I read 7 of those. And then I recently saw a video recommending Nevo's little series of novellas. There's 4 books in total so far. Well, 3 published books and a 4th one just about to publish. So I picked out a couple of those, and then I saw a few other novella recommendations, and it just kind of all came together. So I do want to stress that yes, I read 52 books, but my page average is way down comparative to normal months. I did still read more than I do in a normal month by a significant amount, but I also was pretty sick for an entire week. I didn't record any videos, I didn't go hiking, I didn't go rock climbing, I didn't do anything in that week except for read. I also would like to stress that I absolutely exhausted myself reading that much. This is not something I would normally try to do. It's not something that I would recommend doing. I normally like to enjoy my books and not read as fast as possible. So while it was really fun participating in this readathon, especially getting to be a captain, I definitely will not be putting myself through this very frequently because this was exhausting. So that said, let's go ahead and get into a handful of statistics, and then I am going to very briefly touch on each book. Like I said, we have 52 books to cover, so I'm not going to go into great detail on each one. In total, I read 14,974 pages this month. This is close to about 5,000 pages more than I read in one of my busiest months. That said, again, reminder, I had a whole entire week this month where I did nothing but read. When divided by the number of books I've read, that comes out to 287 pages per book. So as you can see, that's almost 100 pages less than my normal page average per book. My top 3 genres were fantasy with 24 books, LGBTQIA with 22 books, and then young adult with 10 books. My longest book this month was Gilded by Marissa Myers. That came in at 512 pages, and that was the only book that I read that was kind of up there in the page range. And then I had 2 books that tied for the shortest reads of the month, and that was Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Navigate Your Stars by Jessamine Ward. Both of those books had 64 pages. Now, let's get into our star ratings and what books go where. I'm gonna, again, move through these very quickly. I had one 1-star book this month, and that was The Cherished by Patricia Ward. This was an ARC that I received from NetGalley as an audiobook. It was absolutely horrible. Honestly, I would have DNF'd it if I had not been for this readathon. I was determined to read it all the way through, so that I could count it, but it was a struggle. There was a lot of problematic viewpoints. The writing was really, really terrible. The plot was all over the place. The pacing was an issue. This is definitely a book I would not at all recommend. I had a handful of 2-star books. This means that I still probably wouldn't recommend them, but they weren't necessarily DNF quality for me. The first was Pond by Claire Louise Bennett. This is a short novel about a woman, and it's essentially a stream of consciousness about nothing. This woman, it's just following her thoughts throughout the day, except she doesn't think about anything interesting or spectacular. Nothing interesting or spectacular happens to her. It's just very dull, and if I wanted to hear thoughts randomly, I could just listen to my own head. Honestly, even that might be more interesting. Then I had Secluded Cabin Sleep 6 by Lisa Unger. I like thrillers. I did not like this thriller. This was too out there. There's too many unrealistic plot twists. The whole concept of the story was just wildly unrealistic. I get that, there's some suspension of disbelief, but this was just asking too much. Then we had Lore by Alexandra Bracken. I've been wanting to read this one for a while. I've been on a Greek mythology kick. I finally got around to it. This was Greek mythology turned into a modern young adult sort of fiction. Lore's a young girl fighting to survive. Athena's a human. Like, all of the Greek mythological characters are basically humans, and they're in this weird death duel sort of a scenario. I had a hard time with this book. I didn't love it. Definitely not my favorite Greek mythology retell. And then another of my ARCs was The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer. Thought I was gonna love this. It is a book that's described as being for book lovers. It was very juvenile, felt like it was written for a middle grade audience. Honestly, the plot didn't make a whole lot of sense. The characters were boring, and some of them were a little bit creepy. It's supposed to be set in reality, but there were a lot of things about this that were unrealistic. I just really ultimately couldn't get behind it. Now, into our 3 stars. So again, a 3-star for me is like so-so. It wasn't bad, it wasn't amazing. I would say that if you like that specific genre or you like something about it, it might be worth a read, but I would probably check it out from the library instead of purchasing it. First, I have She is a Haunting by Trang Ton Tran. This sounded so amazing. I was really hyped for this book. It's about a young girl whose father offers to pay for her college with one condition: she's got to come live in his house in Vietnam for a certain period of time. And if she does so successfully, then he'll give her the money she needs to go to university. So she goes over there, accepts the challenge, and the house turns out to be haunted. This book was so-so. The gothic vibes were cool, and the haunting was okay. I didn't find it all that scary, and I did find that parts of it kind of dragged, but I loved the look into Vietnamese culture. The family dynamics were interesting, and overall, it was just an okay book. After that was House of Cotton by Monica Brashears. I had an ARC of this one. I wanted to love this. It was just okay. The concept sounded super interesting. We have a main character who is hard on her luck. She's basically working as a sex worker, and then she gets hired on to become a model at a morgue. And she is posing as people that have died to give families closure. Sounds super interesting, but there were a lot of things that were really uncomfortable in this book. I wished that the social critique had gone farther. I wish that there was a little bit more coherency in the plot. And yeah, for me, it had a lot of really good elements, but just not the right execution. And then we have Camp Zero by Michelle Min Sterling. I did a full-scale review up here if you'd like to check it out. This one was a post-apocalyptic climate change disaster sort of a deal. We have a main character who is spying on someone. This was a case of a book feeling like it was cut off too soon and there just wasn't quite enough information. Concept was interesting, characters were likable enough, but I felt like it just stopped abruptly, and it could have used a little bit better editing. Then it breaks my heart to say we have In the Lives of Puppets by TJ Klune. This was a book I really wanted to love. TJ Klune is one of my favorite authors. I loved Cerulean Sea. I also really enjoyed Under the Whispering Door. This one was a miss for me. Unfortunately, it just didn't work for a multitude of reasons, and I have an in-depth review up here if you'd like to hear more about that. And then I had both Gilded and Cursed by Marissa Myers. I read the Lunar Chronicles a long time ago, and I really enjoyed it, but I was much younger then. I read these 2 books thinking that I would probably feel the same magic. Unfortunately, that was not the case. These books were okay. They take the tale of Rumpelstiltskin and they kind of twist it and reinvent it. It's honestly barely recognizable as Rumpelstiltskin. I liked parts of it, but I really disliked this weird toxic relationship that our main girl character has with the evil baddie. Basically, she continually relies on his promises even though he has broken his promises over and over and over again. And for me, that got kind of tiring. I also had Enchantment by Catherine May. This is kind of a self-help reflection type book. She's the author of Wintering. I enjoyed the concept of wintering. For me, Enchantment was just okay. It talks about finding wonder and magic and enchantment in day-to-day life. I don't think I really learned too much, but it was an okay read. And then I read the short story, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I actually saw this as a recommendation from Criminale, and I picked it up because I enjoy short stories, I enjoy creepy vibes, and he raved about how good this was. I don't know, maybe I missed something. Maybe in this fugue state of reading that I was in, I didn't absorb the whole message. But for me, this one was just okay. It's about a woman, and I think she's dealing with postpartum depression. She is hallucinating and in rough shape. There's little sympathy towards her, and it just shows her deterioration inside this room. After that is Freshwater by Akweke Emeze. This is another book that I was really surprised to put in the 3-star category, but comparative to The Death of Vivek Oji, I just felt like this wasn't quite as good. Even You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty, for me, elicited much more of an emotional response. Freshwater was decent. It was a really unique concept for sure, but I found myself with a lot of questions and not so many answers. I was a little confused at parts, and while I appreciated the uniqueness of this, especially considering it was a debut, it definitely wasn't my favorite of their works. This book was on my Trans Girl April TBR. Then I have Come Tumbling Down and Where the Drowned Girls Go. These are 2 entries in the Wayward children's series. They're going to be out of order because I have them by rating, not by the order that they go in the series. But these 2 were probably my least favorite in the 8 books that are published so far. Again, they weren't bad, but I found the worlds to be less than compelling. Especially in Where the Drowned Girls Go, I found the main character to be a little bit frustrating. I had a hard time with her constant insecurity, and then her making decisions and then like immediately regretting those decisions, and just a lot of the confusion around the worlds that she's been involved in. There's definitely better books in the series in my opinion. And my final 3-star read of the month was When the Moon Was Ours by Anna Marie McLemore. This was another book that I read for Trans Girl April. This has a lot of magical elements, or characters are kind of interesting. There's a rivalry between 2 families. There were parts that I really liked, but there were parts that were a little overly simplistic and parts that were a little bit confusing. This definitely has a young adult vibe to it, but it wasn't a bad read. Now, to get into the 4-star reads, this is the biggest list out of anything. I had so many 4- and 5-star reads this month. It was very, very exciting. First up, I had Notes on an Execution by Dania Krukowka. I loved this. This is about a serial killer and his victims, but it's mostly told from the perspective of his ex-wife, his family, his victims, and a lot of reflection on him and the things that happened to him. It's a very interesting book. I love that it's told through the perspective of women instead of the perspective of the monster. That made it very unique. Then I had Hell Followed With Us by Andrew Joseph White. This was another book on my Trans Girl April TBR, and I was very excited about this one. This is a dystopian fic, and the start of the dystopia is that there is a massive weather event that wrecks society, and it's followed up with a religious cult that essentially tries to take over society, at least in the United States. This book is super, super gruesome. The dystopia is really interesting. Our main character is well done. I love the way that they are thinking about their gender, but also thinking about their survival and the realities that face them. I really felt sorry for our main character. They have been through so much. And I thought that the overall premise of the religious cult and what they were trying to accomplish was very interesting, but I could have done without a lot of the really graphic, icky descriptions. It just was a little too visceral for me at points, which I know is a strange critique. Then we had Down Among the Sticks and Bones and In an Absent Dream by Shannon McGuire. This is, again, part of the Wayward children's series. These 2 were ones that I really enjoyed. I thought they were very well done. Characters were compelling. The worlds that they were plummeted into were interesting, and overall much stronger than the last 2 entries. Then I read Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. One of the categories for my Nevermore-athon readathon was Greek mythology, so you're going to see a lot of Greek mythology coming up. So Ariadne was enjoyable. I didn't know much about Ariadne's story. I hated Theseus by the end of the book. This was not a mythology that I ever remember studying at any point, so this whole story was pretty new to me and I really enjoyed it. And then we had a trans classic, Nevada by Imogen Binney. This was another book that was on my Trans Girl April TBR, and I'm so glad that I read this. This was such an interesting book. It follows a character named Maria, who is basically questioning all their choices in life. They are in a stagnant relationship, in a dead-end job. They just aren't happy with how things are going. So they essentially quit their job, steal heroin from their girlfriend, steal their girlfriend's car, and then take off on a road trip across the country to Nevada, where they meet a young boy who may potentially be trans and become sort of a role model for that person. I think in particular, I found Maria's inability to deal with her emotions really interesting. Then I had She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a book about a young woman living in a famine-stricken village. After her father and her brother dies, she actually steals her brother's identity and uses it to become a monk. At first, this is just a survival mechanism, but then they really take on that persona and they become a warrior and a leader. It's a really interesting book, and I know that the second book in this series is dropping very, very soon. This was also on my Trans Girl April TBR. Then I had The Wilder Woman by Ruth Emmy Lang. This is about two young women who are off searching for their mother who went missing about 5 years in their past. They both have special abilities. One can see into the past via these memories, and one can actually predict things to come. This was an interesting ride. I found some moments slightly predictable, but I really loved the writing in it, and I overall really enjoyed the story. Then we had The Daughters of Sparta by Claire Haywood. This was not one that I had planned to read this month, but I found myself needing another book with a Greek mythology theme, so I picked it up, and I'm glad I did. I've read several books recently that covered Helen, Clytemnestra, and Cassandra, and this one actually I think was my favorite. I thought that both Helen and Clytemnestra were easy to understand within this book. I thought it was a great perspective on both stories, and I felt like the pacing and the plot was really interesting, really an enjoyable read. After that, we have An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. I enjoy River Solomon's writing so much. They have such unique concepts, unique characters. They keep things really action-packed and interesting. This book is about a ship in outer space. There's a bunch of people stuck on the ship. The ship has a very racist structure, similar to like the Jim Crow South. We have a very harsh dictatorship that keeps people subjugated, and we follow a main character's journey as they essentially rise above their station and then try to escape this ship. And then we have Pandoras Jar by Natalie Haynes. This is about Greek mythology, but from more of an academic standpoint. This isn't a retelling of a particular mythology. This is more just talking about Greek mythology, and it discusses 10 different characters. I found this really interesting. I really enjoy Natalie Haynes' writing, and I thought that this was a good complement to some of the other books that she's written. And then I had the Subtweet by Vivek Shreya. This was not originally on my Trans Girl TBR. I decided to pick it up around mid-month, and I'm so glad that I did. This follows a character named Neela as she reckons with racism and politics in the music industry. She has a song that she's created, and someone does a cover of it and gets immediately much more attention for it than she got for the original version. That causes her to question the music industry and like what whitewashing does for an artist. And I thought this book was very interesting. It was funny, it was challenging, it asked a lot of really interesting questions. The only criticism I have of it is that I wish it was longer. You can see it is a very short book, and I definitely wanted more information about the things that were happening. And then we had another ARC. This was Atalanta by Jennifer Saint. This follows the character Atalanta as she joins the Huguenots and makes a name for herself in a very, very misogynistic world. Atalanta is a warrior. She is Artemis's personal warrior, in fact. She is one of the fastest people alive. She's incredibly strong, she's loyal, she's tough, and she's fierce. And she never gets enough credit, even though she saves the Huguenots' asses over and over and over again. She makes Jason a hero, and then when they all get home, everybody forgets about her. So she is very much maligned. And I found this to be pretty interesting. I thought that it was a good retelling. I wasn't super familiar with the story. I think I remember reading a little bit of it in high school somewhere, but I didn't remember it in great detail. That said, I don't know if it was the most compelling mythology retell that I've ever seen. It wasn't bad, but it just wasn't as sparkly as some of the other ones that I've read. And then I had The Human Origins of Beatrice Porter and Other Essential Ghosts by Soraya Palmer. And this is a debut novel. It follows a family across the Caribbean through Jamaica and Trinidad and then in the United States. It's told through the eyes of the two children in the family, and they're reflecting on their parents and their relationship. And there's a lot of magical realism and folklore that's mixed in. I thought this was a really good debut. It kind of reminds me in some ways of both Mame and Black Cake, except there's a lot more magical realism and folklore mixed in. This one had kind of a quiet release, so let me just say I would definitely recommend picking this one up. I think Soraya Palmer is going to be a good author to watch. And then next up, I have Horse Barbie by Gina Rosero. I had an ARC of this. It's publishing later this year, I want to say in June. And this is a memoir about Gina's experiences as a trans woman, first growing up in the Philippines and participating in trans beauty pageants, and then later moving to the United States, where she became a model. And she was so scared of losing her modeling career that she closeted herself and refused to tell anyone that she was trans or acknowledge being trans at all. It plays a number on her psychologically. On one hand, we see Gina being extremely successful and rising through the modeling ranks, but on the other hand, we see her coming home racked with guilt and anxiety over her identity and her inability to just be who she is. This was a very moving and interesting memoir. I really liked the writing style of it. It was easy to read, easy to understand, moved at a really fast pace, and Gina is really, really humorous, and she's got a lot of really great stories to tell. And then I read a small Greek mythology novella called Wool by David Elliott. This is about the Minotaur, and it's just kind of a short, like, poetic piece about the Minotaur and the slaying of the Minotaur. This kind of was a nice, like, supplemental thing to my earlier reading of Ariadne. They kind of go hand in hand, and this gave a little bit more of the Minotaur's perspective, whereas Ariadne focuses obviously more on Ariadne's perspective. Then we had Navigate Your Stars by Jessamine Ward. This was a very short novella talking about Jessamine's family and her experiences. I love Ward's writing, and I'm here for anything that she does, whether it's a short story, a novella, or a novel. Then we had Night Wherever We Go by Tracy Rose Payton. This is historical fiction about slavery. We have 6 slave women trapped on a plantation in Texas. The slave owner decides that in order to make himself financially successful, he is going to breed slaves and sell them. The women that are on this plantation want nothing to do with it, and they band together to prevent unwanted pregnancies. I also had The Hummingbird by Sandro Veronesi. This is a translation from Italian to English, and this is about a man and his life and his different family members. It's non-linear, it bounces around, it talks about bad luck, and then it talks about him kind of settling into a life towards the end with his granddaughter. Both Night Wherever We Go and The Hummingbird were picked out for me by Melinda at A Web of Stories. I have 4 reviews of these books up here if you'd like to hear more details on my thoughts. Then I had Comfort Me with Apples by Catherine M. Valente. I originally saw a video about this from Nell over at Book Hunt, and it sounded really good. This is kind of a mystery. We have a woman, she's in a house, she's just like devoted to her husband, and her observations just feel kind of strange. Like the way that she's describing things that are going on around her, things that are happening to her, the people that are in her life, you just get the sense that something isn't the way that it's supposed to be. I felt like the vibes in this were really creepy. I liked the writing and everything. I was a little bit disappointed once I figured out what exactly was going on. It wasn't a horrible concept, but it wasn't the most amazing thing ever. Overall, I really enjoyed it. It's especially impressive when you consider how short this book is. And then we have The Black Tides of Heaven by Neon Yang. This is part of the Tensorate series. This was also on my Trans Girl April TBR. This book follows 2 twins, and they live in a society where you don't actually have to decide what gender you are until much later in your life. Eventually, one twin chooses to be male and one twin chooses to be female. They both get set on different directions, and their mother is a terrible person who is essentially like the dictator of the area that they live in. This was a really interesting book. I enjoyed it, and it was a short dive into this particular series, so I'm definitely considering picking up some of the other books in the series. And then I had The Empress of Salt and Fortune and When the Tiger Came Down from the Mountain by Nevo. This was a series recommendation that I saw also on Nell's channel, Book Hunt. I'm really enjoying this little series so far. You can read the books in any order that you like. They don't have to be read chronologically. They each read as a standalone. And I'm super excited because I just found the 4th book that's about to drop in a few months from this series on NetGalley. So I have one more book to read before I'm like caught all the way up to current publications, and then I'll jump into this book that's on NetGalley. And the last of my 4-star books was Sissy, A Coming of Gender Story by Jacob Tobiah. So this book is really well written. Jacob Tobiah is very, very funny. And overall, I think that their discussion of gender and sexuality and just generally identity was really, really interesting. They initially defined themselves as a gay male and then realized that their gender identity was more complex than just that. The story explores their growing up, their coming to terms with their identity and who they are over a period of multiple different realizations. And I really liked all of that. I felt like I learned a lot from it. Overall, I thought this was really well done, and if you're looking for a memoir that might help you understand identity a little bit better, this would be a good one to read. This was also on my Trans Girl April TBR. Now, finally, we're gonna get into the 5 stars. This is definitely not as long of a list as the 4 stars. My first 5 stars was Medusas Sisters by Lauren J.A. Baer. This book was so good. This is a retelling of essentially Medusa's story, except it's not focused on Medusa, it's focused on the word on sisters. And I actually just read Stoneblind last month, so I got to see a book from a multitude of perspectives about Medusa. This may be controversial, but I think I actually liked this version better than Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes. That said, Stoneblind was still good. I just like that this had a little more focus on this particular story instead of what Athena's doing and what everyone else is doing. I wanted to just kind of follow what was happening on this island, and this definitely does that. And then I had The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gorsacek. This is about a witch named Agrabota. She's living in the woods, hiding away from Odin, who has tried to force her to give him prophecy, and when she's refused, he actually burned her alive. She ends up meeting Loki, the trickster god, and they fall in love. They spawn 3 monstrous children who are a part of a prophecy of the end of the world. This book was very unique, and I'm so glad that Melinda at A Web of Stories recommended it to me. This was such an amazing read. I've been really reading a lot of Greek mythology, but I've never dabbled in Norse mythology, and this was a wild ride. Then we had When the Angels Left the Old Country by Sasha Lamb. This was on my Trans Girl April TBR, and I loved this book. This was so clever and creative. This book follows an angel and a demon as they leave their shtetl and they come to the United States because one of the members of their shtetl has immigrated through Ellis Island and has run into some problems, and they're coming here to make sure that she's safe. This book was so unique. I've never read anything like it. This mixed in Jewish culture and Jewish religion with an immigration story, with gender identity. Like, there was just so much to love. It was humorous, it was serious, it talked about some real life issues, things that are still relevant today, even though this book is set like in 1920 or 1930. I loved the voice, I loved the writing style, it was paced really well. Highly, highly recommend this book. And then I read As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Katua. This was brutal. It was beautiful, it was moving, it was emotional, but it was absolutely brutal. This follows a main character who is living in Syria as Syria crumbles around her. She is a pharmacist, but due to the fact that most of the physicians and surgeons have left Syria at this point, she is working as a surgeon in a hospital. She's never been trained aside from just in field experience, and she is doing her best to try to save lives. She is suffering from horrific post-traumatic stress, and the depictions of post-traumatic stress are some of the best that I've ever read. Don't think that this is going to be a light read. It is brutal, intense, emotional, moving. It is a gut punch, but if you can handle those things, 10 out of 10 would recommend this. After that, I have Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aoki. This was a book that I saw recommended twice. I saw it first on Scott's channel at Gunpowder Fiction Plot, and I saw it second on Kevy's channel at Say Kevy, who is one of the lovely hosts of Trans Girl April. This was a space opera. I don't think I've ever read a space opera before, first of all. Second of all, this was unlike anything I've ever read before. I'm so glad that I saw these recommendations and took them. This follows a character named Shizuka, and Shizuka is a violin virtuoso who has lost their ability to play the violin. In exchange for resuming their ability to play the violin, they've made a deal with the devil, basically agreeing to deliver 7 souls of other violin prodigies. So far, Shizuka has delivered 6 souls without regrets. Then they meet this character named Catherine, who is a trans girl and is essentially homeless at the time of meeting. They take her in and they start working with her, and she has all this raw, untrained talent, and Shizuka starts teaching her how to play in a more classical way. And through this teaching, Shizuka ends up bonding deeply with Catherine and is really struggling to deliver her soul. This was so interesting. Just every time I thought that I knew where this was going, it went in a different direction. I don't know how to advertise it any differently than that. Just suffice it to say, this is an incredibly unique book. If you like sci-fi, if you like mystery, if you like drama, if you like explorations of relationships, probably you will like this book. Just go in knowing it is definitely a bit quirky and different, but in all the best ways. And finally, my last 2 5 stars were Lost in the Moment and Found and Across the Green Grass Fields by Shannon McGuire. These were 2 of the remaining books in the Wayward children's series. I really loved these 2. I thought that they played with themes that were a little heavier. They had worlds that really revolved around what these children were experiencing in their real life. I thought that they touched on some really deep and interesting topics, and overall, I really loved them. And honestly, this series as a whole is pretty creative and good. If you're a big fantasy reader, and especially if you like your fantasy with a lot of real life issues and discussion of really relevant themes, you should definitely check this series out too. My average rating for books this month was a 4.05, and usually I just pick 1 favorite and 1 least favorite, but I had so many books this month that I actually picked 3 favorites and 3 least favorites. So my 3 least favorite books this month were Pond by Claire Louise Bennett, The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer, and my absolute worst book of the month was The Cherished by Patricia Ward. My 3 favorites this month were The Witch's Heart by Genevieve Gorsuchek, When the Angels Left the Old Country by Sasha Lamb, and my absolute favorite of the month was As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Katua. So definitely make sure you check out those 3 books. They were so good. I can't recommend all 3 enough. In a month where I read so many books, these 3 definitely stand out above the rest. Ultimately, a really successful month for me. Trans Girl April went really well. I ended up reading quite a few books for that, and so did Nevermore-athon. I'm really excited to have participated in both, so thank you to everyone that hosted. And if you liked this video and you made it all the way to the end, please hit that thumbs up button and comment down below what was your favorite book that you read last month. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell, so that you never miss a video. That way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.